The young man slowly came to his senses and heard a terrible scream around him. He was puzzled because he did not understand what was happening, because there was so much noise around. A moment later, he saw a crowd of people shouting near him. He was puzzled because he didn't know who all these people were in front of him. But a moment later, he was taken aback as he saw light. He was puzzled because he saw a light coming from the floor. At that very moment, he screamed and asked where they were. But moments later, he, like everyone else, saw a beautiful maiden. But at that very moment, they heard a roar and turning around saw a monster. Everyone present assumed that this was some kind of prank with a hidden camera, since there were no such monsters in the world. The young man was very scared. He did not understand what had happened. He knew that he had definitely been at home and had dinner just recently. But a moment later, he heard notifications on his phone. He slowly brought the phone closer to himself and saw an invitation to the game. He was a little puzzled as he noticed that a new game had been released. But once he accepted the agreement, he remembered nothing more. At that very moment, he heard a terrible scream from a man who was furiously beating on the door. The young man tried to calm everyone present, as he understood that they were now in the same boat. At that very moment, he reached out to his closest comrade and asked if he knew anything. He sighed heavily, and taken aback, said that he didn't know anything, but he noticed that he could touch other people and realized that this was not a dream or a hallucination. Moreover, he did not feel any sense of awkwardness. At that moment he was taken aback, as he saw the beautiful maiden again. But a moment later everyone noticed the maiden's fire and light around them. They also heard the eerie roar of a monster. The maiden, looking at all those present, greeted them all, and said that first she would like to express her gratitude for responding to their invitation. Everyone present was shocked. They didn't understand what she was talking about. She announced that they had all been chosen as warriors to save the dying continent. Everyone present was shocked and shouted that it was just some kind of prank. The maiden asked everyone to listen to her and pay attention to what she would say next, since all her words were directly related to their chances of life. She said that they could not go to the continent. The young man was taken aback, since he did not expect such a thing. She looked intently at everyone present and said that she would repeat her words, and they must hear her. Some were screaming, some were listening, and some people were thrashing in agony and crying. At that very moment, she announced that only a few survivors would be given the right to go to the continent. She said that they were now at the starting point, and at the same time, they could consider it a kind of waiting room. The girl reported that the room contained everything they needed for survival: food, water, provisions, and even various weapons. At that moment, the young man realized everything. She also said that they could further receive a specialization, but at the same time, some people would receive a characteristic ability. He realized that he had entered a world that he had seen in games or novels. The maiden said that there were several levels of normal, rare, heroic, and legendary. She said that they could use the weapons that were in the room. At that moment, the young man chose a spear. She said that they would use this weapon for their own protection. He heard her words, but at the same moment he was taken aback as he heard a loud roar behind him. The young man, like everyone else, was shocked, because unexpectedly for everyone, the wall began to crack. The Virgin informed them that they all had different homelands, different personalities, and that this place had been prepared for Togo to maximize their individuality and help them grow, and that if they would pronounce the window state, they would be able to understand what she had been telling them all along. At that very moment, the young people began to shout and call for the window to open. The young man screamed in anger and also called the status window. Moments later, he was taken aback, as he saw in front of him a window, the state and information about himself. He was a little worried, as he did not know whether his indicators were good. At the same moment, he saw that he had received an ability. He knew that some people also received a characteristic ability. He was informed that he had a heroic level of the soul eye, and with this, he could open his own and others' state window, as well as the hidden level of the ability. At the same moment, he turned around and saw the windows of everyone else. Li Qiyong was puzzled. He saw that there was a limit to growth, and also saw that some had a common assessment. Li Qiyong was immediately taken aback because he wanted to know what was written about him. He had the lowest indicators. There was no point in him trying hard, and no matter how hard he tried, it would be difficult for him to overcome the third-class level, and almost all indicators disappointed him, despite the fact that his intelligence and luck were not bad. After everything he saw, the young man was taken aback and froze in shock as he realized that he simply would not survive. He stood rooted to the spot, not knowing what to do in such a situation. At that very moment, he realized with fury that he would simply die in this room. A moment later, the terrible monster finally destroyed the wall. At once, a whole horde of monsters flew into their small room, with Rusha getting in their way. Li Qiyong stood in one place, as he understood that there was no point in fighting at all. But at that very moment he was taken aback, as he heard a cry from the crowd. The young man, looking at everyone present, shouted for them to immediately raise their weapons. Li Qiyong came to his senses at that very moment. The young man shouted angrily that everyone clearly saw the status window in front of them, so everyone should immediately take up arms, since this did not look like a joke at all. Li Qiyong immediately looked at the young man with a fierce grin, as he saw his characteristics with his power and realized that this was his meat shield. But a moment later, some looked around in confusion and missed the opportunity to fight off the animals, and they attacked them, sparing no one in their path. Li Qiyong. At that moment, he ran up to the young man and told him to stay ahead, because he intended to cover him. The young man was taken aback because his new comrade was about to fight. Li Qiyong said that he simply couldn't continue to sit idly by and that they had to try to do something. The young man joyfully shouted that his few words had made him feel better, but at the same time, he noticed that his new acquaintance looked very frail. At that moment, the young man turned around and horror froze on his face. He was puzzled and shocked as he saw a terrifying monster heading towards him, and it opened its ferocious mouth as it intended to deal a crushing blow to the young man. But not even a few seconds had passed before the monster received a very strong blow. Li Qiyong shouted angrily at his new acquaintance, as he himself had said that they needed to fight. He shouted at the young man that he had to keep up with the monsters if he didn't want to die. As he ran away, he shouted to his comrade to also run away if he valued his life. They ran away in a hurry, no matter what, but at the same time they heard the terrible screams of the other people. Li Qiyong looked into the distance with a fierce grin. He understood that everything was going according to his plan, and for a start, he still managed to shelter one pig. At that moment, he was taken aback, just like his comrade, because the little monsters were urinating on them. But the young man, gathering all his strength into his fist, swung and dealt a very powerful blow with his weapon, causing the monster to scream and fly off to the side. But the other monster wasn't going to give up so easily. He immediately pounced on Li Qiyong. But his comrade still managed to cover his back at that moment. Moments later, he turned around and asked his comrade if he was okay. Li Qiyong looked at his new acquaintance with a satisfied smile, since he was really useful. He thanked him for saving him and also said that they needed to stock up on water. In a moment, they rushed to the exit, but at the same time, they did not forget about the supplies. After a few minutes, they noticed a large door. The young people immediately beamed with happiness, as they understood that they had succeeded and found a way out. Li Qiyong immediately shouted and called his comrade, but a moment later he froze in place as he heard a drawn-out voice and a plea for salvation. He froze in place, but after a few seconds he turned around and saw a young man who was surrounded by monsters and they were biting him, but with the last of his strength he prayed for salvation. The young man looked at his comrade with bewilderment as he stood in place without moving. The young man cried and looked at his comrades with pleading eyes. Li Qiyong could not stand it and rushed to the sufferer at that very moment. The young man looked at his savior with a smile and hope, but to his regret, Li Qiyong took the bag of supplies. At that moment, the young man lost all hope of salvation. He realized that his savior had simply noticed the bags of supplies. Li Qi-yong took the bag and ran away from the dying man and the monsters. The young man, puzzled, shouted to his comrade. But at that very moment in his old age, he made a decision. He raised the thought that he must also run away and save his life. At the same time, the young man looked after them in horror, and at the same time, he was slowly being swallowed up by the monsters. He reached out to them with all his might and begged for help, but his pleas were not heard. Li Qian, while running away, cursed himself, but at the same time asked for forgiveness from the young man he left behind. At that moment, he sighed heavily with remorse, because he knew that he should have simply thanked the young man, because thanks to him, he would be able to survive in the future. After some time, the young people sat quietly in a small cave. The young man asked his friend what they would do next. Li Qiyong sighed heavily and said that if he had known, he would not have been sitting in such a place. He was puzzled because he understood that his new comrade had strength, but no intelligence, and at times he even felt sorry for him. Li Qiyong sighed heavily and said that first they needed to find out where exactly they were. He asked his friend if he had ever played similar games. The young man asked in bewilderment if there really were people who had never played. Li Qiyong sighed heavily and asked his companion if he had seen anything like this before. But in response, he was met with only silence. Li Qiyong sighed heavily and said that they should raise their level. He understood that perhaps at this stage there was a system in which stats were raised by killing monsters, and during the battle with them, they could receive specialization. Li Qiyong knew very well that it would be difficult for them ahead, but they had to become stronger. Fortunately, they had weapons and a shield, drinking water and food. Li Qiyong understood that their situation was much better than that of others. But at that very moment, the young people were taken aback, as something monstrous approached them. They looked at the monster in surprise and screamed, as they did not expect anything like this. But at that very moment, they wondered why he didn't attack them. Li Qiyong looked at the monster and used his power, and realized that in front of them was a low-level monster with very poor eyesight and low intelligence. Without wasting a minute, he gave a sign to his companion. He understood that he could and must kill his opponent. At that very moment, he grabbed his weapon and pounced on the stupid monster. He managed to quickly get his bearings and dealt him a crushing blow. The young man, in turn, looked at his companion with horror, as he did not expect anything like this. Li Qiyong shouted at the monster with despair and anger, wanting it to die quickly. After a few minutes, he finally fell to the ground with a crash. At this, Li Qiyen sighed heavily, but at the same moment he noticed that his strength had increased. He was glad that he was gaining experience from killing, and then he breathed a sigh of relief with a smile since his assumptions were correct. At this point he looked around in bewilderment as he felt his companion's gaze on him. He came closer to him and said that if he could do it, then he could do it too. He knew that this was so because he had good stamina. At that very moment, the young man with glowing eyes looked at his companion and asked what his name was. Li Qiyong looked at the young man with a satisfied smile and introduced himself at the same moment, but he understood that he had to remember his name, since in the future, he intended to extract everything from him, including his soul. Pak Dok-ku introduced himself at that very moment with a joyful smile. Li Qiyong walked closer to the young man and looked at him intently. A moment later, he cut a small piece of cloth and began to run around his new companion in a hurry. The young man was puzzled, as he did not understand what he was doing. But a moment later, Pak Dok-ku saw a small armor on his neck, and at that very moment, his resilience increased. Pak Dok-ku looked at his comrade with joyful eyes, as he was glad to receive such a gift. Li Qiyong sighed heavily and looked away from the young man, as he knew that the shield had to be strong. Pak Dok-ku happily thanked his comrade and said that from now on he could completely rely on him in everything. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything, but first they had to get out of such a place. Li Qiyong turned around with a smile, looked at his comrade and said that they should stop being slackers later. They hadn't even taken a few steps when they heard a terrible roar. The young people turned around in a hurry as they heard that the sound was more distinct. At that very moment, a young lady appeared in front of them, screaming with tears in her eyes and running towards them. She desperately begged for salvation and ran in fear while being pursued by ferocious monsters. Li Qiyong shouted to his comrade that they needed to get out quickly. But a moment later, the young man was taken aback. He was furious because he didn't know how to fight off such a number of monsters. He was shocked and did not know what was wrong with the girl, but at that very moment the thought came to him to open the eyes of his soul. At that moment, he was taken aback and looked at the information about the young lady with bewilderment, although the overall assessment was not so bad, and he also saw that she had a legendary class. The young man was taken aback and, looking at his companion hastily, asked why he had frozen in place. Li Qiyong was surprised because he didn't expect to see a man who possessed legendary-level mana in my path. At that moment, he turned around and shouted to his comrade that they would fight because they had to protect and save the girl. Park Dok-ku was taken aback and froze with a puzzled expression on his face, as he did not know if they would be able to deal with the monster. Li Qiyan immediately informed his new comrade of the action tactics. At the same time, the young lady continued to run away from the terrible monsters. Li Qiyan, peeking out from around the corner, gave a signal to the girl. She didn't lose her composure and ran quickly towards him. The young lady, without wasting a minute, ran with all her strength while the monsters were chasing her. A moment later, she managed to hide behind the backs of the young people, but the monsters still continued to pursue her. A moment later, the young man and the monster met eyes. With the speed of lightning, the formidable and ferocious monster dealt a very powerful blow, but the young man managed to block its blow with the help of his shield. Li Qiyong, without wasting a minute, ran towards the monster as he intended to deal it a crushing blow. At that very moment, he pushed off from the ground and rushed towards his opponent. He beat the monster with all his might, while his companions sighed heavily. But a moment later, he was taken aback and cried out to his friend as more monsters began to attack him. But unexpectedly for the young people, an unknown person dealt with all the monsters. Li Qiyong, in turn, was shocked by what he saw. He turned around hastily, wanting to understand what had happened. At that very moment, he saw a handsome young man. They met eyes and stared at each other for a few seconds. Li Qiyong was very surprised and puzzled, as he did not expect to see anything like this. He didn't understand where the young man came from. At that moment, he used the soul eye and saw all the characteristics of the young man. But a moment later, he was taken aback, as he saw that the young man was a regression of the Altanis. Li Qiyong was puzzled, as he did not understand what he had seen at all, and at the same time he wondered if their savior was returning in time. He saw all his characteristics and froze in shock. He was also informed that just talking with the young man was a great honor for him. The young man was taken aback and looked intently at everyone present. He noticed that the young men looked as if they were already accustomed to such battles. Park Dok-ku happily hugged his friend and said that he seemed more accustomed to this kind of thing. Li Qiyong, in turn, wondered if he could accidentally see the young man's abilities. At that moment, he was taken aback as he saw that in front of him was a true sword master. A moment later, his face twisted as he envied the young man and his abilities. Kim Hyun-sung, in turn, looked at everyone present with bewilderment. Li Qiyong looked at the savior with bewilderment, as he did not understand why he was looking at him so intently. He wondered if he had been caught spying on his abilities. Li Qiyong knew he had to greet his savior first. Li Qiyanvi's expression changed within a minute, and he introduced himself with a smile and also thanked the young man for saving him. He assumed that their savior walked everywhere alone. Kim Hyun-sung said with a smile that he was currently gathering survivors and that he had also prepared a survivor base at the proper camp. At that moment, the young man was taken aback and asked how many people there were in total. Kim Hyun-sung thought for a moment and said that he had gathered about 30 people who were capable of fighting, and he also said that he would like them to join the camp. The young man looked at him intently because he understood that he was very dangerous. He understood that in words he was good-natured and kind, but he did not know if what he said about the camp of survivors was true. Li Qiyong wondered if the young man knew that such a gathering would only become a hindrance, but he saw a regression in front of him and did not know what to do in this situation. Li Qiyong assumed that the person in front of him knew how to get through this location, and most likely he knew all of its secrets. At that moment he realized that it would be most beneficial for them to maintain a good relationship with the young man. Li Qiyong immediately accepted the offer with a joyful smile and asked if he had received his specialization. While the young people were talking to each other, Li Qiyong remembered the girl they had saved earlier. He glanced sideways and noticed that she was sitting quietly and crying. He came closer to her and extended his hand. Li Qiyong, with a beaming smile, asked the young lady to stand up and take his hand. She was taken aback and sheepishly thanked him for his help. Kim Hyun-sung noticed the young people at that moment. He was taken aback as he did not expect to see a young lady, but moments later he ran up to her. Jung Ha-yang looked at the young people shyly and introduced herself at the same moment. Kim Hyun-sung joyfully shouted that he was very glad to meet you, and at that very moment he introduced himself to the young lady. The young people looked at him in bewilderment, as they did not understand why he was so happy. Kim Hyun-sung looking at the girl, he asked if she was okay. Jung Ha-yang hugging her savior, she said that she was fine. Kim Hyun-sung looked at the girl with embarrassment and said that if she suddenly felt uncomfortable, then she should definitely tell him at any time. She looked away from him and timidly said that she was fine and that he didn't need to worry. But at that very moment, she shyly hid behind her new acquaintance. Li Qiyong stared at the young man as he saw the regression, the swordmaster, the one who could not win. He was the one who realized, and he was the one who carried the victims on his back. Li Qiyong knew full well that the strongest man in the world had already seen the end once. Li Qiyong knew that the young man had rewound time because he wanted to change the future, but he assumed that by regressing, he would first try to get everything that could be useful to him. He glanced sideways at the girl, as he knew she was definitely on the list of things he wanted to get. Meanwhile, the young lady caught their gaze and looked away, embarrassed. After a few seconds, she plucked up her courage, and looking at the savior, said that she was late, but still wanted to thank him for saving her. He smiled and said that there was nothing to thank him for. Then she hid behind him again as she was very embarrassed. Li Qiyong looked at the girl menacingly and intently. He saw that she was a person who possessed wild magic potential. Kim Hyun-sung is a warrior who started another round. He looked intently at the young people, because he understood that he had found a treasure. Li Qiyong was pleased with everything that was happening, and at the same time looked at his victims with a grin, because he knew that they would go with him to the very end. After some time, the young people visited a small camp, and at that moment, they looked with joy at all the survivors. They saw that people worked together tirelessly. Pak Dak-koo happily told the young man that he had found a truly amazing place. Kim Hyun-sung smiled and said that he had stumbled upon such a place by chance. Li Qiyong, in turn, understood perfectly well that the young man had already known about the camp in advance. At that very moment, everyone present was taken aback as a young lady ran towards them with a joyful smile. She greeted her friend with joy, but noticed that he had not come alone, but with the newcomers. He sighed heavily and greeted the girl, but at that very moment she said that he was late and that she was very worried. Li Qiyong noticed that the girl spoke very kindly to the young man. At that moment she asked who the newcomers were. The young man said that they would now be with them in the camp. Li Qiyong did not waste a minute and used his power. He used the soul's eye, and he noticed that she was a selfish, cynical, unemployed person with no title. She was also older than Kim Hyun-sung, but despite this, she greeted him with joy and addressed him as an elder. Li Qiyong was very confused because all of her characteristics were just terrible, and yet, in the overall assessment, she mentioned that she could be a perfect couple with Li Qiyong. At that very moment, she joyfully addressed each newcomer. Park Dak-koo introduced himself with a happy smile and also began introducing all his friends. Young Haiyang introduced herself shyly. But at that very moment the young lady looked menacingly at the girl. She was dissatisfied with everything she saw. Li Qi-yong looked at the young lady intently and wondered if she was judging people. Pak Dak-ku was big and had a weapon, so he easily entered their camp. Compared to him, the girl with a limp and the skinny young man could have failed the competition and not gotten into the camp. Ji-hee looked at the young man with a happy smile and said that he was very large and looked like some kind of tank, while she noted that he had already managed to deal with many monsters on his way. He shouted with a joyful smile that he had killed several, but all thanks to his comrade, because if it weren't for him, he truly would no longer be in this world. She looked at the frail young man in surprise, as she had not expected such a thing. Li Qi-yong, in turn, looked intently at the girl, but said nothing. At that very moment her face changed, and with a joyful smile she said that she was very glad to meet them all. She said that she would certainly accompany them to the camp, and she also informed them that the men and their women lived separately. Ji-hee looked at the young man with a joyful smile and asked him to take care of her. Li Qi-yon, in turn, looked at her intently, as he knew that they were of the same feather, but, in turn, he used his radiant smile and said that he would definitely do it. They also noticed the rest of the camp members, and everyone present was happy, as they saw the warriors who could save them. All those present rejoiced with joy as they saw the warriors. Li Qi-yong looked closely at everyone present. He noticed that this was indeed a safe zone, but not for him, but for them. He was shocked and did not understand when he had already become the local shield. The next day he was sleeping quietly when he suddenly heard some noise. Li Qi-yong woke up puzzled, but saw his joyful comrades standing next to him. Li Qi-yong sighed heavily and called out to his friend, saying that he looked around and noticed that there weren't many people fit for battle in the camp. He apologized, but still asked how he managed to keep this place safe. Kim Hyun-song said with bitterness in his voice that the situation was not so good. Unfortunately, there was not enough drinking water and food for everyone, and there were not enough people who were able to fight, so they had to save those people who were able to fight. Kim Hyun-sung sighed heavily and informed his comrades that things could get worse at any moment. Li Qi-yen understood that the food would soon run out, and with monsters lurking at every turn, he understood that people who were incapable of fighting would only become a greater burden for them. The young man looked at his comrades in bewilderment and said that people are not a burden. Li Qi-yan, in turn, said menacingly that they were a burden, and at the same time he noted that he was not involved in charity and did not intend to save them. At that very moment dead silence reigned. Park Dak-ku asked his comrade if he was going to leave, but he said that he had no intention of doing anything like that. He sighed heavily and said that they couldn't just sit and wait for a miracle, as it was useless. Kim Hyun-sung sighed heavily and was taken aback, as he did not understand what he should do in such a situation. But a moment later, he looked at the young people and was taken aback because his new acquaintance said with a satisfied smile that if they fought together, they could overcome everything. And of course, this also concerned him. He was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear anything like this, but he still thanked them for their support. Li Qi-yong looked at the swordmaster with a smile and said that he understood what he was thinking and that he probably wanted to save all the people. He, of course, understood his intentions and accepted them. Li Qi-yong immediately sighed heavily and said that he was completely different from him, since he was not the type of person who easily sacrificed himself for others, and he also noted that moving in Group B was not his intention. Li Qi-yong told young people that it would be okay if they thought he was a little selfish. Kim Hyun-sung looked at his comrade intently and said that it was not so, and he could understand him, because it was obvious that he wanted something. Li Qi-yong was taken aback and looked at his comrade in surprise, but at the same time he was glad, because he assumed that he would say to sacrifice himself for the sake of friendship. Li Qi-yong looked at his lovely repressor with a satisfied grin. At that very moment he said that they also wanted to be privy to his plans that he would have in the future. He just couldn't leave him alone to reap all the benefits, Kim Hyun-sung was taken aback, as he didn't expect anything like this. He was very surprised, as he had expected to hear something like this. But a moment later, he looked at his comrade with a gentle smile, so he understood that he knew. At that very moment, he reported that at the starting point, the maiden in the announcement gave several options. She said that only the few who completed the tutorial would get to the continent, and only a few survivors would have the right to go to the continent. From her words, it was clear that they were in for a purge and survival. Lee Ki-yeon said that he thought that the option of survival was actually impossible. Lee Ki-yong immediately said that he did not know how possible it was for a small number of people to appropriate most of the resources. He said that if his goal was not cleansing but survival, then such a crowd of people unfit for combat was even more undesirable. Lee Ki-yong in turn understood the harsh reality perfectly well, since he knew that even if the sick and old people were not being held captive by monsters, they would in any case simply die of hunger. Lee Ki-yeon-yi, looking at everyone present, said that this was obvious to absolutely any person. The swordmaster backed away and said that he understood perfectly well what he was talking about. Kim Hyun-sung. At that very moment, he extended his hand to the young man and asked him to take care of only him. Lee Ki-yeon looked at the swordmaster with a satisfied smile, since he actually just wanted to cuddle up to him because he was a repressor, but he still accepted his offer with a smile. Lee Ki-yong looked closely at his companion, as she noticed that he was now looking at him with a completely different look, while he knew that the young man was not strong. But for him, he became a competent specialist, like a tactician or a manager. After some time, the young people came across a group of monsters. They fought no matter what. But still the monsters were advancing, and it was hard for the young people. Kim Hyun-sun, in turn, went to the rescue of his comrades at the first call. He, using all his strength and capabilities, chopped down monsters no matter what. He easily dealt with all the obstacles in his path, and all he heard was a terrible scream in response. He saw the monster writhing in pain and agony, but he still had no intention of letting the monster go, and a moment later he heard a loud crash from the monster's fall. Lee Ki-yong, in turn, watched the young man from afar with a satisfied smile. Kim Hyun-sung informed his comrades that there were still several monsters ahead, and he intended to hold them off. At the same moment, his comrade shouted that he understood everything, but at the same time, he had to take all the food. Pak Dak-ku, while collecting food, he noticed that there were far fewer monsters in this area. The young man assumed that the area had already been cleared, but at the same time, Pak Dak-ku wondered if their companion had actually been fencing while he was on Earth. Lee Ki-yong sighed heavily and said that he didn't know if that was true, but he still assumed that the young man could do something like that, or maybe it was just his specialty. Pak Dak-ku sighed heavily, and at the same moment he wilted. Lee Ki-yong looked closely at his comrade and said that he did not need to worry, since they would soon also discover their abilities. He also told his friend that he was very useful even without specialization. Park Dak-ku said that he did nothing wrong and that all the credit should go to their comrade. Lee Ki-yong looked at the young man with a gentle smile and said that without him he simply would not have made it to the camp. Pak Dak-ku was taken aback and looked at the young man with embarrassment, as he did not expect to hear so many pleasant words. But a moment later, the young people were taken aback when they saw a notification window. At that very moment, the young man saw that several specializations had opened up for him, and he could look at detailed descriptions of each. He was very happy, because everything happened faster than he expected. But at that same moment, he looked in surprise at the specialization of her commander, and the commander had a rare level. The warrior had a normal level, because any team needs a warrior who can fight at the front. The archer had a normal level, but he could hit at long range. The mage had a normal level, but he was a ranged fighter who used magic every time. Lee Ki-yong understood that being an archer was cool because he could shoot from a distance, and with the help of magic he could raise his mana, which was at the very bottom. But at that very moment, he read about a commander with a rare level, and this was a specialization that had no combat abilities. Representatives of this specialization did not fight on the front lines. but only assessed the situation behind and gave orders. The young man thought for a moment, not knowing what to choose from the list, but at that very moment their friend approached them and said that it seemed like a specialization window had opened for him. Lee Ki-yong revealed what options he was offered to choose from. Kim Hyun-sung was surprised when he heard that he was offered to become a commander. Lee Ki-yong was a little puzzled, as the commander seemed like a good specialization to him for some reason, but at the same time, he wondered if this map was actually a trap. At that very moment, his friend shouted that he didn't know why, but he thought the commander would be perfect for him. Pak Dok-koo smiled and told his comrade that he was indeed the ideal type for a commander, and if he commanded them, they would definitely win. He also said that he could already imagine how cool he was behind them, waving his hand and giving everyone instructions. Kim Hyun-sung sighed heavily and said that this specialization had quite a few bonuses, but other specializations primarily added a few points. He sighed heavily, as he thought that he and his stubbornness should not choose this card, but his comrade shouted and demanded that he choose a commander. Kim Hyun-sung said that the young man could choose the archer, but at that moment his friend demanded that he choose the commander. Lee Ki-yong sighed heavily as each of them advised him on what to choose, and at the same time they told him the pros and cons of each choice. After a few minutes, they no longer said anything and only demanded that he choose quickly. After a few minutes of arguing, they switched to more aggressive tactics among themselves. While they were arguing, the young man still wondered what he should do and whom he should choose, since they had stunned and confused him. He sighed heavily, and yet, having collected his thoughts, he chose what would suit him best. After he made his choice, he was enveloped in a bright light. But after a moment he looked into the distance in bewilderment, as he had expected more. At that very moment the young men pounced on him, as they had expected him to wait a little before making his choice. They immediately cried out and asked who he had chosen. Without letting the young man say a word, they asked whom he had chosen. At that very moment he looked at them with a smile and said that he was now a magician. Park Dok-koo was shocked by his friend's choice, as he expected him to choose the commander. Kim Hyun-sung asked the young man why he chose a magician. Lee Ki-yong said with a smile that he simply trusted his instincts. He understood that the great swordsman was sorry that he did not choose the archer. But he had a good reason, because physical activity is not his style, so he did not want to be an archer. He was drawn to the commander, but he could only get one stat point. He understood that a mage was a good option, and it would be good for him to go the path of maintaining high intelligence. New knowledge flowed into his head on its own, one after another, as if lining up in his head. Moments later, he saw new information about himself and was delighted with the outcome. Lee Ki-yong turned to his friend and asked if he had chosen his specialization. He sighed heavily and said that he had been dealt a warrior with a shield and a priest, so he was confused and did not understand what was best for him to take. At that very moment the young men said in one voice that he should choose a warrior with a shield. He was puzzled, as he understood that a priest was also a good option, but they again said in one voice that he must choose the war with the shield. A moment later he sighed heavily and obeyed their will. Lee Ki-yong looked at his friend and asked what he had chosen. At that very moment he showed them his trusty shield. He looked at his friend with a smile and said that from now on he would be a warrior with a shield. Lee Ki-yong looked at his comrade with a smile and said that he had made the right choice. He was as happy as if he saw an official meat shield in front of him. At that very moment, the young man congratulated them with a smile and said that it was time for them to return. Kim Hyun-sung was a little puzzled because he didn't know how to divide the food. The young man said that a few bags would be enough for them. At that very moment, he gave his comrade the rest of the provisions. Kim Hyun-sung looked at his new acquaintances with joy. After some time, they returned to the survivors' camp. The young lady looked at her friend and asked where their savior was, as she was very hungry, Ji. He sighed heavily and said that he would be back soon. The girl was puzzled by such an answer, as she wanted him to return as soon as possible. Ji-hai looked at her friend and said that she could have a snack of what was there. The girl thanked her with a smile. Ji-hai looked to the side in confusion and saw a man reaching out to her. She looked at him with disdain and asked why he was looking at her so intently. She also asked if he really wanted to eat her. At that moment, she broke a piece of bread and sighed and said that it was her and Miss Hee-yeon's food. The man looked at them with puzzlement. Ji-hee looked at the man with disdain and said that she could only give crumbs to the idle parasite, but the man immediately began to greedily collect the crumbs. Ji-hai shouted with a joyful smile that he would amaze and that he did the right thing by collecting the crumbs. But at that very moment she was taken aback as she heard that the young people were returning. The young people slowly entered the camp, under the shouts of everyone. Ji-he happily ran up to the young man. She reached for the supplies and said that they would carry everything themselves from now on. He looked closely at the young lady and asked her to take care of the others as he still had things to do and needed to leave. At that moment, the man approached Lee Ki-yong and said with a satisfied smile that he could give him the bag. Lee Ki-yong looked at the man gloomily but did not answer. At that very moment, he simply turned away from the man and walked in his direction. Pak Duk-koo asked his friend in confusion if he really didn't plan to share the supplies. Lee Ki-yong sighed heavily and said that he had said earlier that they were not volunteers at all. The young man consoled him and said that it was true, but he still understood that it was somehow wrong. Lee Ki-yong said that if they wanted to eat, they could pick up the sword and go out, suggesting that their new acquaintance had transferred them to the camp to stir up the people. He watched everyone present closely as he saw how they ate with joy. At that very moment, he noticed the young lady who was happily pleasing everyone. Lee Ki-yong looked at the girl intently as he knew that in the absence of the great swordsman, she was in charge of everything in the camp. He knew that in front of him was the type of person who is strong in front of the weak, but weak in front of the strong. He understood that she was a local knee-jerk in the absence of a leader. But at that very moment, the young man was taken aback, as he felt that something was wrong. He turned around and saw that some were barely happy, while others were working tirelessly. At that very moment, he noticed his friend who was working. The man approached the girl and asked why she was working so slowly, as he was irritated by her speed. She, trembling with fear, asked for forgiveness. At that very moment, the man shouted that they would all be left without food if they did not fulfill their quota. Lee Ki-yong looked at everyone present in a puzzled manner. At that moment, he looked at everyone present again with a grin, as he generally understood the kind of treatment Chung Ha-yang received in the camp. At that very moment, he called his comrade. Lee Ki-yong asked his friend if he remembered the girl they met yesterday. Lee Ki-yong told his friend to give her the bag and keep his gaze fixed on her. The young man was surprised by his friend's behavior, but a moment later he realized that his friend simply liked the girl. He looked at his friend with a satisfied smile and said that he understood and that he could trust him. At the same time, the young lady was quietly collecting stones. Lee Ki-yong sighed heavily and looked closely at the girl, as he understood that she was very lonely and having a hard time. He knew that no one but them would take care of her, but he also understood that she would be extremely grateful to them for their care. He understood that in this case, she would immediately trust them and rely only on them. Pak Duk-koo rushed towards the young girl with a joyful smile, but moments later he was taken aback as he saw something strange. At the same time, the man was smiling and offering the young lady some food. Lee Ki-yong stopped at that moment because he saw something suspicious. He looked at the man with fury as he did not know who he was. Lee Ki-yong was furious as the man approached his precious treasure. Lee Ki-yong looked away from the girl because he knew that there was no need for a good relationship when he himself did not have enough food. He understood that it was as clear as day because there could be no other purpose. At that very moment, the young man turned around because he saw his friend's gaze. Lee Ki-yong signaled to his friend to just keep going. The young man nodded in response to his friend and did as he was told. At the same time, the young man looked at her lady with a smile and, handing her a loaf of bread, said that they were not on bad terms, so he brought her food. The young lady was taken aback because she didn't know if this was all normal. He said with a smile that she should not refuse and should accept the offer, because it had not been easy for her all this time. She was taken aback and timidly agreed. But one way or another, she still thanked him for his concern. He said with a smile that there was nothing wrong with that. She was grateful to the young man for his concern. But she also knew that if Li Qiyan hadn't saved her in the cave, nothing like this would have happened. She remembered how he smiled tenderly back at her, and now her thoughts were absorbed by the young man. At that very moment, the man looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was thinking about. He looked at her with a satisfied smile and said that, if she didn't mind, he would like to get closer to her. Yung Ha-yang looked at the man with confusion, as she assumed that he was simply offering her friendship, but after a moment, she smiled and agreed with him. But at that very moment, the young lady was taken aback as he placed his hand on hers. She saw his full gaze, lust. At the same time, she asked him to let go of her hand, but she also noticed that he had no intention of doing anything like that. Trembling with fear, she asked him what had suddenly come over him and begged him to let go of her hand, but the man only became enraged after her words. He looked at the girl with fury and asked how she could be so short-sighted. He looked at her with fury and asked if she really thought that he was just doing some kind of charity work. She was taken aback and froze in shock. He looked at her and said that if she had received anything, she should give something in return, and the young lady was very scared. He pulled her towards him and said that if she wanted to live well in the camp in the future, she should grovel before him. He asked angrily if she was really that stupid and didn't understand the situation. Park Dok-koo came closer to them and angrily told the man to let go of the girl's hand before he broke it. The man was furious because he did not understand who had approached them and who dared to interfere with them. But at that very moment, he was taken aback as the young man hit him on the arm. Park Dok-koo looked at the man with anger, as he could not imagine that there was such trash in the world. He told the man that he should stop pretending as his arm was not broken. The man was furious, but at the same moment he was taken aback as the young man pulled him by the collar of his clothes. Meanwhile, the young lady watched everything that was happening with surprise. Park Dok-koo, in turn, did not intend to stand on ceremony for long with such a person, and in that very moment, he threw him away. Everyone present was shocked by what was happening. The young people looked on in bewilderment as the scene of violence unfolded. At the same time, Li Qiyan quietly watched everything from the side and did not forget to eat. The man was shocked and screamed as he saw blood on his face. Park Dok-koo looked at the man with bewilderment and asked him to stop writhing in pain, since he didn't even put any force into his blow. He came closer to the man and said that since he had made such a scene, he would hit him so that he would immediately shut up. But at the same time, the young lady blocked his way. She looked at her friend intently and asked him to stop as everything was fine. At that moment, Li Ji-hai ran up to them and shouted for them to stop immediately. She was in shock and did not understand what they were doing, but she hastily asked the man if he was okay. Li Ji-hai immediately turned around and shouted at the young man that violence was prohibited in the camp. She couldn't understand what he had done. He was taken aback and said that the man grabbed the young lady's hand hard and was abusing her, so he hit him, but he also said that he clearly saw everything with his own eyes. Li Ji-hai was taken aback by what she heard and quickly asked the man if what the young man had said was true, but the man denied everything. Mr. Shok-woo, looking at everyone present, said that there was a misunderstanding while he was holding the nth lady's hand, but to some extent by mistake. The young man was furious and shouted that it was not a mistake at all. Li Ji-hai immediately asked the man to tell her everything in more detail. He sighed heavily and said that he wanted to get a little closer to the girl, and since she said she felt the same way, he misunderstood her. Li Ji-hai immediately looked at the girl and told her not to hide, but to tell everything in person. Yung Ha-yang was at a loss at that moment as everyone was staring at her. She was scared and trembling with fear as everyone was whispering behind her back. At that moment, she turned around and froze in shock as she saw evil grins while everyone was saying that she was the heroine of a romance novel. Jung Ha-yang was confused. She didn't understand why everyone was looking at her with such eyes, because she clearly understood that she had done nothing wrong. She was puzzled because she knew that on Earth and in the New World, no one had ever been on her side. Jung Ha-yang, having withstood the pressure, burst into tears and also said that it was all true. She also said that the man forcibly pulled her by the hand and said that if she wanted to live well in the camp, she should be with him. She said that she was very scared of him, and at the same time she could not utter a word. Li Ji-hai sighed heavily and told the girl that she didn't understand that she was saying that because she was crying. Li Ji-hai was puzzled because she knew that this situation was not very good, but she also said that Mr. said that he wanted to get closer to her, and in response, she agreed. The young lady froze for a moment, as it was true, but she did not want anything like that at all. Looking at everyone present, she said that she understood his words in a different meaning, but at the same time she asked for forgiveness. Li Ji-hai looked at the young lady menacingly and said that she was far from a little child and that she should not solve all her problems with tears. Li Ji-hai looked at the young man intently and said that he should first figure out what exactly was going on before he started throwing his fists. Li Ji-hai said that they don't know who is the perpetrator and who is the victim in this situation. At that moment, the young lady bowed and asked for forgiveness. Li Ji-hai looked at the girl intently and said that she didn't need to do it in front of them. Li Ji-hai, at that moment, she looked at them with a smirk and strongly recommended the girl to apologize to the man. She said that the victim in this situation was the man himself. The young lady was taken aback and froze in shock. Li Ji-hai looked at the girl with a fierce grin and asked why she froze. She told the girl to immediately fall on her knees and ask for forgiveness. Jung Ha-yang trembled with fear and at the same time timidly asked for forgiveness. At that very moment her expression changed, and she once again asked the man for forgiveness. Li Ki-yan looked into the distance with a satisfied grin and slowly walked towards them, as he knew that now was his turn. At that moment, he looked at everyone present with cold fury and asked what was going on. In fact, he couldn't even imagine that such a commotion would arise. Li Ki-yong understood that it was none of his business what happened between them. Li Ki-yong knew that the only thing that mattered was that the young lady was at a dead end. The young lady looked at the young man and said with a smile that he had arrived just in time, but he looked at her angrily and asked if she was in her right mind. She was taken aback, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and asked if she really thought that they had some kind of regional playground. He looked around and asked angrily what would happen if their screams brought monsters running to their camp. At that moment, everyone was taken aback and looked at each other with bewilderment and horror. Li Ji-hai sighed heavily and said that the situation was out of the ordinary, but the young man assured her that he had watched everything that had happened from afar and generally understood everything. He sighed heavily and said that she had said earlier that it was still unknown who was the perpetrator and who was the victim in this situation. Li Ji-hai said that when a group of people corner one person, anyone would be afraid. The young lady was shocked and shouted that the girl was definitely to blame for this situation. He looked at her intently and asked if she could really be sure that the man was innocent. She was taken aback, as she did not know what to answer him. At that very moment, the young lady caught the gaze of everyone present. Li Ji-hai looked at the girl with a grin, because he understood that she could not answer him. He knew that if she said anything else, then all the responsibility would fall on her. Li Ki-yong, sighing heavily, said that they were poisoning an absolutely innocent person, and if their leader saw everything that was happening now, he would not be happy about this. At that moment, everyone was taken aback and looked away. They were scared because they knew that if he abandoned them too, it would be the end for them too. Li Ki-yong walked closer to the young lady and said with a smile that, in his opinion, she was not that kind of person at all. She looked at him with admiration and embarrassment as she saw that the young man was helping her out of a similar situation. Li Ji-hai was furious She didn't understand how he could know what the girl really was like since they had only known each other for a few days. Lee Ki-young looked at the girl menacingly and asked if she told her school friend that she wanted to be closer to him, would her words mean that she wanted to sleep with him. Lee Ki-young looked at the girl intently and said that she should not, like everyone else, give in to public opinion, and they should all think about everything carefully. The young lady was furious. But at that very moment she was taken aback and turned around as everyone began to support the young man. They said he was right, and at the same time they started putting pressure on Mr. Seok-woo. Lee Ji-hai was shocked by everything that was happening, as he quickly changed the opinion of those around him. Lee Ji-hai looked at the young man with fury and asked if he was really serious just now. But at that very moment she was taken aback and froze in shock as she saw his fierce grin. Meanwhile, the young man looked at her with a fixed gaze, because he wanted her to see his gaze. He understood that she had to see that he was now the king of this camp. She was taken aback and froze while everyone stared at her, waiting for her to do something new. Lee Ki-young sighed heavily and asked everyone present why they were crowded together. Looking at everyone, he said that first they should treat the man, since he had an injury. Lee Ki-young looked at the young people and asked them to take care of the man. Lee Ki-young said that before the leader returned, they should clean up and make sure they could get back on schedule right away. He also noted that monsters might come running because of what happened, so they should check out the area. The young man looked at his friend with a smile and said that he would do everything. Lee Ki-yeon looked at the girl and said that after everything that happened, they needed to talk a little. She was taken aback as she had not expected such a thing, but she still agreed. Lee Ki-young left, but he heard all the conversations, but at the same time he understood that the girl should not pay attention to such things, because the important thing is that she received the position of the favorite of the holder of power. Lee Ji-hai watched them go with fury as she realized that they had set her up and taken away what was due to her. Lee Ki-young sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, asked her to sit down for a conversation. Trembling with fear, she cried and asked for forgiveness, since she had no such intentions at all. He sighed heavily and said that he knew, and that she was not guilty of anything at all. Lee Ki-yeon looked at her with a gentle smile and said that she could tell him how it really was. The girl was taken aback as his beautiful smile melted her heart. At that very moment she calmed down and obeyed his words. She said he suddenly grabbed her hand and started squeezing it painfully. Lee Ki-young gasped and asked if that really happened. Trembling with fear and bursting into tears, she said that afterward her friend came and hit the man. He was puzzled, as he did not understand what she was saying at all. He ignored everything, but he knew that the most important thing was to express his sympathy to her. At that very moment, he said that it must be very difficult for her. She smiled and said with embarrassment that this was not so, because now she felt much better. She thanked him again with a smile. Lee Ki-young sighed heavily and said that there was nothing to thank him for, because if you look into the situation, she was not to blame for anything. Jung Ha-yang shyly said that she thanked him for believing in her. She said that he had been helping her constantly since their first meeting, so she was interested and at the same time tormented by one question. Why was he so kind to her? Lee Ki-young said with a smile that he only did what he thought was right. He said that he had a younger sister at home and they were the same age. He smiled and said that, looking at the young lady, he involuntarily remembered his sister, but at the same time he understood that this was an outright lie. Since they were not at all similar, he forced himself to say the younger sister for the sake of credibility. She was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, and also said that she had 2 older sisters, but they had not communicated for a long time. She sighed and said that she didn't have parents. Lee Ki-young at the same time said with a gentle smile that they were very similar, since he also didn't have parents. She was taken aback and said embarrassedly that it was true, and they looked a bit alike. Lee Ki-yeon looked at her with a gentle smile, as he was glad that they still had something in common. He understood that in this way it was easy to add mutual understanding and interest. At the same moment, he said with a smile that he hoped it would not burden her. Lee Ka-young, looking at the girl, said that he would like them to communicate freely, but at the same time he stated that this was exclusively his desire. Jung Ha-yang was shocked by this, but after a few phrases from the young man, they agreed to communicate informally. Jung Ha-yang was very embarrassed by such words, but at the same time, she was happy. Meanwhile, the young man looked at her with a satisfied grin, as he knew that she was now completely captivated by him. At that moment, he used his power and looked closely at the girl, but after a few minutes of checking, he noticed that she did not yet have a specialization.